Sometimes the Lord clearly calls us to serve Him in a certain way, and He gives us an assurance that He's with us and that He will enable us to accomplish what He's called us to do. But the Lord often doesn't do it in the way we expect Him to, or on the timetable in which we expect Him to do it. Sometimes, even though we've been assured of His presence and His help, our circumstances seem to be going in the opposite direction, and we're left thinking, Lord, have you forgotten? Are you still going to do what you said you were going to do? Well, in today's reading from Acts 23 to 24, the Apostle Paul could have easily felt like that. At the beginning of chapter 23, Paul goes through the first of his many trials in court. They bring him before the Jewish council, and even though Paul handles it with boldness and humility and wisdom, qualities which we think will assure effective ministry, things don't go so well for Paul. He begins by testifying that he has always lived before God with a clear conscience. And the high priest ordered a guard to strike Paul on the mouth. And Paul responds with boldness and says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. But he didn't realize it was the high priest. And when they told him it was the high priest he had spoken to in that way, Paul humbled himself and he apologized for speaking badly against one of God's chosen leaders. So things aren't going so well. And then Paul notices that there are both Sadducees and Pharisees present, and he knows that there is a disagreement between Sadducees and Pharisees regarding the resurrection from the dead. And so Paul is wise. He uses their division to his advantage. He says that I'm a Pharisee and I'm on trial for the hope of the resurrection. Well, the Pharisees take his side. They say, we don't see anything wrong with this guy. He hasn't done anything. But it caused such a big uproar, it caused such a big conflict between the two groups that the Roman commander was afraid they would tear Paul to pieces. So he sent soldiers to take Paul away. So Paul finally gets a chance to defend himself, to testify before the Jews, and he gets punched in the mouth. He nearly causes a riot among the religious leaders, and now he's back in prison, having accomplished absolutely nothing. But Jesus is so merciful. It says in verse 11 that the Lord, not an angel, but the Lord Himself stood next to Paul, and He assured him that He was with him and that he would not die in Jerusalem, but that he would testify for Jesus all the way to Rome. The next day, the Jewish leaders pretended that they wanted to question Paul further, and they asked the Romans to bring him to them, but they intended to kill Paul along the way. The Lord helped Paul again. A young man overheard the plot, and he reported it to the commander. So the commander decided to move Paul to Caesarea, and he escorted him with 500 Roman soldiers. In Caesarea, Paul has his second trial, this time before the Roman governor Felix. And the Jews who were there accused Paul of desecrating the temple and stirring up trouble wherever he goes. But Paul was wise. He just said to Felix, hey, it's been less than 2 weeks since I was in the temple, and they saw me there. And nobody accused me of desecrating anything or causing any kind of trouble. Well, Felix knew that Paul wasn't guilty, but he had him detained, yet he gave him freedom to receive visitors. And Felix himself sent for Paul and listened to Paul talk about his faith in Christ. But when Paul talked about righteousness and the coming judgment, Felix got scared and he sent him away. He left Paul in prison for 2 years, and then Felix was replaced by another governor by the name of Festus. So it's been more than 2 years since the Lord stood next to Paul and personally assured Paul that he was with him and that he would be his witness in Rome. But Paul's still sitting in a prison in Caesarea with no reason to believe that he's going to get out anytime soon. It seemed like the Lord wasn't keeping His promises. But the Lord didn't promise Paul how He would do it or when He would do it. He simply promised that He would do it. And so Paul had to do what we so often had to do. He had to wait and to trust God to keep His promises and to accomplish His purposes in us and through us in His time and in His way.